keep the conversation going with our first panel. Again, as we outlined the agenda for this event, we are interspersing panels with keynotes, and this is our first panel looking at the role of government and the law, and who better to moderate it but my dear friend Rick Cole, who has taught a class in homelessness at the School of Public Policy and is also currently the Chief Deputy Controller for the City of Los Angeles. With him as panelists are Kevin Faulconer, who's also taught with us at the School of Public Policy as our visiting professor for community leadership and government innovation, Liz Mitchell, and Brandon Young. And so without further ado, Deputy Controller, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, and welcome to everyone to what I think will be a provocative panel given the quality of my colleagues. Of course, all of these folks have been in the news and making news. And so we'll be talking about things that are happening right now. Let me say two things before we jump in to reactions to Stephen Ides' keynote. The first is to thank Pete and Howard for doing this. I want to reiterate what Pete said at the outset, which is there isn't enough of this diversity of voices to shape the public policy debate. And just the very nature of using the word homeless or homelessness conflates a whole series of interlocking and overlapping, but also distinctive set of issues. And almost everyone has a mental image of what the face of homelessness is. And it is both right and wrong. There are drug-addled Vietnam veterans out on the street. And if that's your face of homelessness, you're right. There are people like that out on the street. There are other people who see them as little lost lambs who've fallen on hard times and victims of capitalism. And if you can go out on the streets of Los Angeles and you can find people who fit that description. Every caricature, every stereotype is true, but what that fails to capture is the incredible diversity of folks who are unhoused. There are housed people with drug addictions. There are housed people with marital problems. There are housed people who've been victims of domestic violence. And one aspect where I don't disagree with Stephen, but where I differ with Stephen is just as I think Housing First has been overemphasized, you cannot argue with the research that says that communities where housing is cheaper, there are fewer homeless people. That doesn't mean that there are fewer troubled people. That means it's just easier for troubled people to secure housing. So it is a multifaceted problem. My own personal experience, which is the second thing I wanted to touch on, began as mayor of Pasadena nearly 40 years ago. And the census had just come out for 1990. And it showed 234 people who were unhoused in our city. And as mayor of the city, I think I knew 234 people who were unhoused in our city. I knew that was an underestimate. And so I read in Governing Magazine that a city on the East Coast had organized a homeless count independent of the US Census. And so I organized the first ever homeless count in California, the third in the nation. And we counted over 1,000 unhoused people in our city. The good news about Pasadena is that today our count, which now is standardized across the country, is half of what it was in 1992. That's progress, especially in the context of the catastrophe in Los Angeles County that surrounds Pasadena. And yet there are 300 people out on our streets every single night in Pasadena, a problem that a city of our resources, I think, is solvable and a moral issue, as Stephen mentioned at the outset. I've just completed a successful effort to return to the City Council. I knocked on over 5,000 doors, and I talked to neighbors in the district that I will be representing starting in December. And the number one issue was homelessness. Everyone agreed that something needed to be done, but there's a tremendous cynicism that I found, or at least skepticism in most cases, that government has the answer. And that's why I think this panel and this conference is so timely, because I agree with what both Stephen and Pete emphasized at the outset. This is not a government problem. This is a social community problem. And if we don't involve the private sector, if we don't involve the nonprofit sector to a greater extent, if we don't involve the civic sector, and if we don't, as individuals, step up and, as the questioner was saying, you know, where's the stakeholder role of residents and businesses in this? Not just to come to in that classic stakeholder mindset, which is what's in it for me, but rather as how can I contribute to the solution to this pervasive problem. Then I think we can make progress. But we're going to focus on government and the law, and we have outstanding panelists to do that. I want to start with an open-ended question, and start with Elizabeth, and we'll get everyone in on what did you agree with, what really resonated about what you heard from Stephen in the keynote, and then I'd like to come and see where maybe there were some areas where you differed or where you think, by the nature of a 40-minute keynote, there were some key things left out. So Elizabeth, can we start with you?
Sure, thank you. And you know, thanks to Pete for inviting me here, and what a wonderful group we have, and just really brilliant minds. And as I'm looking around, I have to say, with this many really smart, dedicated people and this many resources in a room, it gives some level of hope that things can change, that we can really come to some type of consensus, that we can meet each other, that we can meet each other where we are and move forward. So thank you for putting this together. So I think it's hard for me to find things that I disagree with Stephen about, to be honest. I think his criticism of Housing First is very appropriate. For those of you that don't know me, I am an attorney. I represent a group, LA Alliance for Human Rights, and we sued the city and county. In fact, Brandon was my counterpart on the other side, representing the county for a while. So it's good to see him back up here again.
We tried to settle.
We did. It got worse before it got better.
It got worse before it got better. That's right.
So,
But you had one of the America's most congenial and collaborative jurists.
Depends on who you are, I suppose. Sometimes yes, and sometimes the complete opposite. For anybody that read his 113-page preliminary injunction that he issued against the city and the county, I think they might disagree with you just a little bit, Rick.
Pardon, my tongue was in the cheek.
Yeah. But no, Judge Carter, actually, to those that are familiar with the case, has been very dynamic in sort of forcing this conversation to the forefront, and we have been in the national news a lot for this issue because of the very question that is posed by this panel is, what is the role of government in solving this crisis? But to kind of bring it back to the original question that you posed, Rick.
Where do you agree?
Where do I agree? And I really want to emphasize, I think, on the troubles that we see with the Housing First model. And I don't mean in general. I think that there are some people who really can benefit from the Housing First model. But I think the problem becomes when you start to treat the homeless population like a monolithic population. It is not, as we have talked about, and there are some people for whom Housing First is not only not the right choice, but is actively dangerous. And so one of the examples of what you'll see is through the Mayor's Inside Safe program, where the focus is just bringing people inside, right? Very Housing First focused into motels. And you have people that are not ready to be by themselves, not ready to be in that situation. and then they are put in a hotel with food. They no longer have a real purpose to their life other than, for many of them, seeking out narcotics and using narcotics. And what you'll see when I'm talking about the dangerousness of that mentality is the overdose rates in these hotels have skyrocketed, much higher than the congregate shelter models that we see, or some of the shared housing that I'm sure we'll hear about a little bit later. And so I think the criticism of Housing First and the need to focus on alternatives to Housing First for people for whom that is appropriate, I think is a hugely important topic that Stephen raises, rightly so.
Mayor, where do you weigh in on Stephen's keynote?
Yeah, I would agree. And Pete, great to see you. Thank you for having me all. I used to be known as the mayor of San Diego, but now I'm a visiting professor at Pepperdine, so that's my. But I had the privilege to serve 2 terms in San Diego and 2 terms on the San Diego City Council. And I will tell you that in the last 3 years of my term, I spent more time on the issue of homelessness than any other topic, bar none, period. Why? Because we had to. And so when I look at what Stephen was talking about in terms of the need to act and not necessarily wait to see who's in charge, because guess what? I had many of the same questions that all of you were just asking right now. I just got elected. I was on the city council. I thought I knew. I'm like, who's in charge of homelessness? Where's the rule book? Where's the playbook? What do you go do? And I was tired of arguing with the city and the county, right? City, mayor, the county needs to do more, right? County, et cetera. But I think the need to act. And so in terms of Housing First versus shelter, I think Stephen could have focused more on the need to provide shelter now. And that's one of the things that I did. Because if you want to get folks off the street, you got to have a place for them to go. The young lady who asked the question on scale. You got to have scale. And that's difficult sometimes, right? Because everybody wants action and the solution on homelessness, but I prefer not to have it here in my neighborhood. Right, Kevin? I prefer not to have it here in this business district. So I answer a lot of that as to what is the right particular thing. It's all of the above. I took a yes and when I was doing most of what we were doing. So I set up the city's first bridge shelter structures while I was mayor, 300, and the sprung structures, 300 tents per, and it wasn't just shelter, it was mental health services, it was substance abuse, it was housing navigators. Started the first storage sites for personal belongings, right? We don't have a place, then let's do it. First safe parking sites, folks in the cars don't have a place for them, let's do it, let's create it. But I also said that when we're gonna do that, you have to use it. So it's not okay to have a tent in front of somebody's house or in front of somebody's business or in front of somebody's school or park. And so that issue of quality of life and enforcement in terms of consequences becomes incredibly important. And I felt so strongly about that we created a new division in the San Diego Police Department called the Neighborhood Policing Division, whose sole focus was on quality of life and helping people get off the street. And we had men and women officers who actually loved to get into that division because they were tired of everything not happening, the same old things on the street, who realized that they were going to have political support and a place to help folks go. And we became the only big city in California that actually reduced homelessness by double digits. And I could talk a little bit more about that. But the need for shelter, do we need more housing? Of course we do. Whether you want to call it Housing First, whatever, but come back to me in 5 to 7 years when that housing can get built, or in 10 years, depending upon how long it takes to construct things. So I really approached it with more of a sense of urgency, which is I want to get folks off the street now. I want to give them a safe, clean, sanitary place to go. I picked the locations myself, by the way, as mayor, and I said, I'm going to make a deal with you. It's going to be cleaner and safer in this neighborhood with this shelter than before it was there. So if that didn't happen, you know who to blame. That's why I felt so strongly on ensuring that we did not have tent encampments around our shelters, that people understood that this was going to be a place for people to come, to get better, to get back on their feet, and we're not going to allow some of that other stuff to have. I hope we get into, at some point, just an aside, maybe to preface it, some of the changes that I feel very strongly that need to be made in terms of Prop 47 and what's happening on our streets in terms of theft, crime, and unfortunately, drug abuse.
Okay.
Long answer to your question.
That's a good answer. Thank you. Brandon,
Yeah.
What did you agree with, and what is the role of counties? Because I can see City Hall from here. County is behind some buildings. That's, to me, kind of a metaphor. City Hall sticks out, and the county sort of fades into the background. And yet, the county is far more tasked with the side that Stephen was emphasizing today.
So what do I agree with? I agree with what I think the prior speakers have pointed out. The essential question is, who's in charge? I personally spent 6 months as special counsel to the Blue Ribbon Commission on Homelessness, where my job was every day to answer that question. And at the end of 6 months, I couldn't tell you what the answer to that question is. And that's not because people have animus. It's not because people are stupid. It's honestly not because people are disorganized. We have a governmental system here, at least this is my conclusion, that, and to the extent I disagree with something, I don't know if it's a disagreement, more of something that I would urge others to think about in terms of emphasizing what we heard from our keynote, particularly as it affects Los Angeles, California, and the West Coast. LA is a progressive era city. Our government was forged out of the progressive era at the turn of the 20th century. We are both decentralized and overly centralized. And because of that, we have problems responding to issues that require collective action. And homelessness and the housing crisis in particular, in my view, are part of that. I also agree that incentive alignment is a big problem. There is an issue with when we come up against policy versus practicality. What do we do? Where do we go? And we've gotten to this point in the area where decisions, I believe, are overly politicized. And because they're overly politicized, we don't get to the practical root of what we try to do. To answer the second part, Rick, on what is the role of the county, I'm actually optimistic with respect to the county. I'm optimistic with respect to the county because while it's large and it's cumbersome in its own way, it does just have 5 elected officials. That means only 5 people to hold accountable. Unlike the city of Los Angeles, where you have 15 city council members with their own fiefdom, you have a mayor who is ostensibly in control of the city, but works within a progressive era system that affects the amount of power that she has. So I think it's incumbent upon the county to really take the leadership role. I think it's incumbent upon the county to really help braid together our services system in a way that actually molds to the work that our cities do in terms of developing property. But that's long and complicated work. And it also puts the county at a disadvantage because the county is not on the front lines of law enforcement in the same way as the LAPD is. And another thing I agree with is, regardless of whether we should hire more police, we have too many police, we have to accept the fact that law enforcement is going to continue to be on the front line of the interventions that we have in our system. And until law enforcement understands, is trained, and equipped to help on the services piece, even at that initial intervention, we're going to continue to have poor outcomes.
So let's jump into the legal aspect, since we've got 2 bright attorneys who've specialized in this over the last several months and years. And with Stephen's point about incentives, the crux of the case that's going before the Supreme Court, Grants Pass, and the case law on which it's based, largely the Martin v. Boise case in the Ninth Circuit, all come to rest on the same fulcrum that Judge Carter intervened in Orange County and then in Los Angeles with your lawsuit. And that is, cities, you can't chase homeless people around unless you have housing. And homeless advocates, if you provide housing, you should be able to get people off the streets. That seems to be the crux of the legal issue that will come before the Supreme Court. I may be oversimplifying it. But for those of us who are policymakers, that's going to be a very consequential case. How do you, not weigh, don't outguess the Supreme Court, but how do you weigh those two countervailing forces having been so deeply involved in trying to find that balance?
So that's a good question, actually. Stephen, wherever he went, he and I were on a podcast recently kind of trying to game out what was going to happen at the Supreme Court. And we all sort of, there's a general consensus that we do think that, and not just Stephen and I, but in general, that case is likely to be overturned in some way, or at least restricted in some real serious way. And I think that there are serious implications for that, because regardless of what your position is on the constitutionality and the Eighth Amendment issues and the legal issues, I think from a humanitarian perspective, we can all generally agree that a person should not be arrested just because they don't have a home that night, right? From a humanitarian perspective, it doesn't even make good policy sense. What is that person going to do? You're going to book them. They're going to be released the next day, right? But it's a very different question than if a person does have a place to go and they're choosing not to go there. And those are two different questions. And so I think the issue that was raised in the Grants Pass, and I know several others in this room filed an amicus for various reasons, but part of it, the question is should government, and specifically police, be in the position of making that determination? Right? Is that the government's role? Which again brings us back to the point of the panel, of if you have a human being who truly has no place to go, is just what people call economically homeless, then what is the role in providing a shelter as opposed to a jail bed, right? And I think the problem really becomes government is not flexible in that way. Right? When you have police officers, they're there to do a job, to enforce the law. They're not there to do an entire background check within 35 seconds, to try to determine what type of resources that you have, to say, do you really have a place to go? Are you lying? Are you voluntarily homeless? Are you involuntarily homeless? And yet again, I think we're in a situation where we're treating the homeless population as monolithic. Right? You fall into two categories. You're either you take this shelter bed that I'm offering you, or you're going to jail. Those are your two options. And I think it really comes, regardless of what...
Assuming that the shelter beds exist.
Correct. Assuming they exist in the first place. But I think regardless of what your position and regardless of what the Supreme Court does, I think ultimately it's going to come, particularly here in Southern California, it's going to be a political issue. And if what we're talking about is the greatest success possible, right? How do you balance this sort of social contract that we talk about at the LA Alliance case, that we've talked about, somewhat here, of providing a place to go and then requiring people to go there, right? Or at least, here's a bed for you, we hope you use it, here are services, here's mental health care, whatever it is that you need, but you can't stay here any longer. That's the social contract that we sort of offer and that we expect people to take. But I think...
Although we are not yet resourced to provide.
Correct. That's true. Not to scale, right? Not to scale. Maybe on a micro sense, but not in a macro sense. And I think the better question, honestly, is what is the greatest chance of success with an individual and with a community at large? That's the way I would look at it, is not necessarily even from a legal perspective, whether governments are in the right position, police officers are in the right position, but what is it that we're likely to see success with from both a political, I guess a legal perspective and a political perspective? And I would say from that, the number one option is choice. Right? You give people a choice, and then it feels within their own control. And that's
so
what we've seen so
binary
much
choice.
success with.
You have jail or options
Right.
for housing.
Jail or options. Right. You can, here's a sanctioned encampment, for example. Here's a congregate shelter bed. Here's mental health care, right? When you have a choice and people feel like they have some ownership over their own corpus, over their own body, and their choices moving forward, you're going to get a much higher level of success. And when you have a police officer with a badge, it's very difficult to put, in that binary yes or no situation. That doesn't feel like a choice for an individual.
The political problem with that, but I want to stay on the legal, is there's a lot of people in the public who will say, what the hell are we giving these people choices for? They're either going to go to this housing that we're providing or not. But convincing the public that people ought to have choices may be a political challenge. But
Sure.
let's stick to the legal side. What else could you shed on the legal question of providing adequate shelter, housing, a roof over people's heads versus giving people the choice to stay out on the street wherever they find a place to pitch a tent?
Sure. It's interesting the word choice is used because I think it goes both ways. On the merits of the case, honestly, I don't understand how the Ninth Circuit came to the conclusion that it came to. And what I mean by that specifically is a system at a minimum that does not give situational choice to government for an intervention doesn't make sense, right? If a shelter is available and it's proffered, it is a tool that's available to the government, which is a reflection of the body politic. It is a reflection of the community politic. It is the choice of that government at that point of intervention to make a decision, incarceration, unfortunately, or a choice to go to a shelter. Once we start getting into questions of adequacy, then it becomes much more complicated because it does implicate other rights of safety and privacy and so forth. But simply on the merits on that particular issue, it's hard to accept that the Eighth Amendment would allow somebody to stay on the street when offered a housing, at the minimum from a situational perspective at the time of that particular intervention.
So, Mayor, how do you politically navigate that legal landscape?
I'm not a lawyer. But from a politics standpoint, and I agree with I think one of my two colleagues just said, the issue of options and choice, but the issue of a place to go. I mean, we were under, in San Diego, a similar lawsuit settlement even before Martin v. Boise. And I never disagreed with that because I thought morally it makes sense that you got to have a place for somebody to go, right? I mean, what's the proper role of government, right? What is it that we want to do to try to help folks? You can argue about what that is, but you need to have it. And so that's why we went from, again, spending from a city standpoint, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars a year when I first came into millions by the time I left. And again, not worrying necessarily because, again, as mayor, I was going to be held accountable even if I wasn't technically responsible for things like mental health and others. But again, wanting to act and give somebody a place to go, I thought was the right thing to do. So when we set up the bridge shelters, when we set up the safe parking lots, when we set up the storage, that's options, right? And everybody is different. I mean, I learned that real quick, and even more so, where if there is folks that are staying in our shelters that would go get up, that go, get in the shower, and they're going off to work that day. There were people in the safe parking lots. There was moms and kids that were doing their homework in the back of their car, And when you see that, you're like, yeah, it's important that we have places for it's not a one-size-fits-all. But yet every time we did something a little bit different, you would get a little pushback, right? And so it was my job, if you will, to try to push that envelope and say, I have a problem. What am I going to do about it? I can demagogue it. I can say it's the county's fault, it's somebody's fault, or I could actually try to do something. I erred on the side of action, even if not everything was perfect, and it certainly wasn't. But I think, again, if we don't get to the issue of scale in California, we're not going to make a dent in this issue. And so I do think it comes back to having a place for folks to go. It's not just one single place. Whether it's tiny homes, whether it's congregate shelters, again, I will default to, yes, a little bit of all of it. But I will also default to it's not okay. You can't be doing heroin or meth in front of somebody's house or somebody's business and public urination, all the other things that happen. No, you have to have standards. And there has to be consequences for that. That's a city that, if you don't have those consequences, then nobody wants to live in. That's not a partisan issue, by the way. That's not Republican or Democrat or independent. That's common sense. what type of neighborhoods do we want, how do we help people, and how do we insist that we have some of those standards. So that's kind of the approach that I took, and I think we need to take more of. What would, I think the point of, how much is enough? Is there going to be a certain percentage of what's your point in time count? I'm glad you told me, Rick, that you started the point in time count. What is enough? More than we have now. But I think you have to have some agreement on that, and that needs to be, I think the cities and the counties need to work much more closely together, because you do have a disconnect. I thought Brandon was very honest when he just said, as a guy who spent a lot of time, obviously, in his county, on like who's in charge, right? Because the county has all the mental health money. Cities have land use authority, public safety, and others. But we've got to marry those, man, because if we don't, what we're going to see is what we're seeing on the streets. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. We wouldn't be here if it was just okay. It's getting worse. So what we were doing before isn't working. That's why I believe the bias towards action, increasing the actual number of beds, having consequences for actions is incredibly important.
Let me introduce a dimension that hasn't been raised. The national group, which I would recommend to all of you check out, Community Solutions, which got $100 million from the MacArthur Foundation to do not just academic research, but actually research into what works in actual cities. And they've come up with the term functional zero, which is either by the whole population or segments of the unhoused, that homelessness is rare. That is, you're working for the prevention of people getting out on the street. It is brief. That is, you don't let people live out on the street for years at a time. You intervene before all of the pathologies that come with living out on the street, all of the trauma that comes without living the street. And then non-recurring, which means try to keep people housed once you've got them off the street. And one of the key steps that they recommend communities adopt is the so-called by name list. The federal government requires the nonprofit sector to maintain the homeless management information system, which, because it's a government thing, has an initials HMIS. What is not required is for the fire department, the library, the police department, Metro, or the bus system in the city to coordinate with that. So every time, it was my frustration as a city manager, that every time a bus driver encountered someone, a library worker encountered someone, a police officer encountered someone, they were strangers. We were meeting them for the first time. Instead of having an ability to know who they are and begin to build both relationships of trust and to find out what exactly is the right next step for them. Let me give you a couple of examples of where this worked. We arrest someone for public urination. We let them loose the next morning. With the system that we developed of the by name, we then knew who their case manager was that they hadn't seen in 2 months. And we could call the case manager the afternoon before and say, we're releasing this person on the street tomorrow at 8, and they are willing to wait for you to show up to give them a ride to your office so you can reintegrate them into the system, what we called a warm handoff. So instead of sending a person out on the street to urinate in public again today, we were reconnecting them with the system. Similarly, if someone actually had a housing voucher but had been lost track of by the system because they used to be at this viaduct and now they're at some other place, we could then connect them with the unit that has been sitting vacant for 2 months, waiting for them to reconnect because they've qualified for that. So the trouble with that is then, what about privacy, right? What the government is now big brother. The government is now, even though Amazon knows when we get up in the morning and when we don't want the government to know a whole lot about individuals. What's the state of the law on being able to target to this very heterogeneous population specific services that allow us to actually know how to get the right help to the right people at the right time?
Am I going first again?
Sure.
Okay, so you've hit on such a hot button issue for me because you have, particularly here in Los Angeles, LAHSA, who's our local homeless services authority, will not share that information with city outreach, with county outreach, because they claim these are HIPAA violations. And it is outrageous from a perspective of someone who's just trying to help. Right? When you have various outreach workers, you might have 3 or 4 outreach workers contacting the same individual and they don't know, right? So you have one person on the street, they don't know that they've already been contacted the day before or they're on some other list because you don't have information sharing because of these claims of right to privacy. But when you look at what HIPAA actually says, it's only talking about medical privacy. And so the question is homelessness, your status as a homeless individual, does that count as a medical condition? And I think universally we would say no. And so my understanding is LAHSA is getting that information from HUD. There are some former HUD folks here that you might want to blame for that. So I think there's a real conversation that needs to happen around privacy because what you're talking about is government intervention and trying to get folks off of the street and connected with shelter and housing, and you have other government authority that will not share that information, it makes it incredibly difficult and incredibly inefficient when, again, you have 3 or 4 agencies all working on the same individual and nobody knows because nobody's sharing information. It is...
and the public fed up with
right.
the billions of dollars being spent.
That's right. You solve that problem and you're going to save the city and the county and of Los Angeles and LAHSA at least $250 million right there.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the issue is we have people masquerading as lawyers or lawyers who are masquerading as data experts who don't know what they're talking
Lawyers
about.
masquerading as people.
Or lawyers masquerading as people. That's right. But what it speaks to, though, and this is a soft criticism of the system, but a very important one. There's such a lack of because everything is so decentralized. There's such a lack of communication, and just going back to where we started of who's in charge. Well, even from a lawyer perspective, who's in charge in the system to render the legal decision that county can share data with nonprofit 1 or 2 or city A, B, or C, right? There's not clarity on even who's making that legal determination on something that I'm probably trivializing it. Put a good lawyer in a room for a week, have him or her draft a memo, you'll get your answer. And then you'll be able to determine if a law needs to be changed or not. I know, the county has actually tried to be forward-looking on this, but there are also other things outside of a legal interpretation that prevent information sharing from happening. But the core to me of the problem is miscommunication and interpretations that aren't rooted to anything actually related to the laws that they're trying to interpret.
Mayor.
Communication, I think, becomes so important if you actually want to get results, right? Because you can spend a lot of money with a lot of different entities, and if they're not talking to each other, everybody's spending a bunch of money, but you're not helping somebody. I saw a lot of that.
Which damages trust on the part of the person involved as well.
Of course it does.
That's right.
And if you're dealing with different entities and people aren't sharing information, and just because you went to one shelter who has a different database than the other shelter, they didn't know, some of the things in terms of your medical history, et cetera. But just as, if you would, a proof point that it didn't start out this way, but it became one, I think, to your point. When COVID hit, I was still in office. It was my final year. And as I think all of us remember, the whole issue of what are we going to do with folks in our congregate shelters, right? Because we had bunk beds, and you can't have it for the social distancing. So we moved, and we moved quickly. And there was no conventions happening because everything was shut down, right? And hotels and everything. So we opened up our convention center in San Diego, one of the largest convention centers in the country. Huge part of our economy here, but got shut down. And so we put all of the homeless providers in the convention center, social distance and everything. And we said, let's try to use this actually as an opportunity. So let's bring in the county mental health. Let's bring in the VA. Let's bring in, our nurses. Let's bring in all of our housing navigators. I had city folks, kind of volunteer to help make sure that everybody was in the system. And we treated it as from an incident command standpoint with a lot of our fire rescue folks that were actually running this as an incident, right? Because it was. And so everybody was literally in the same room. City, county, state, and I said,
Big room.
big room, a really big room, right? And I said, let's treat everybody as the individual they are. What's preventing you from getting a place of your own tonight or this week? What's preventing you? Because everybody has different things, right? So that's why you wanted to bring everybody there. And we transitioned 1,000 people out of there into a place of their own. And so I think that goes to, if you can actually talk and share, you can't be in this business in politics if you're not an optimist, right? Because I believe the glass is half full. I wouldn't be doing this. And I believe folks don't want to be homeless. I believe they want to get help and support. And so if you're going to try to help do that, make it easy to actually accomplish the goal. And so what we saw when everybody was in the same room and there became kind of an esprit de corps. There was hey, we can do this. We're helping folks. And you see the results on people's faces. Hey, I'm getting that apartment today. Or, hey, I got that voucher I didn't know I was eligible for. Well, shit. Shoot. If you were out on the street pinging back and forth, that might take you 6 or 9 months. So I'm a huge convert of getting all of the information, one-stop shop, to be able to help to do that. Because then you're actually moving the needle. And if you can't treat it as what is preventing this person today, tonight, from getting help, or next week, what are we doing?
Before we turn momentarily to questions, let me just offer what I used at the door 5,000 times in talking to people about this issue from every walk of life: renters, homeowners, young people, older people, people who lived in our community for years, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats. I'm a Catholic, and so I tend to think in threes. And so I was able to tick off 3 things when people said, okay, I agree that homelessness is a big problem. What are you going to do about it? And the first was starting with what Mayor Faulkner just mentioned, which is declare an emergency, but treat it as an emergency. All hands on deck. Not just everyone in government, but our private sector, our nonprofit sector, our community. People want to do more than give $5 to someone at the gas station and feel guilty that they're going to go buy fentanyl. They want to contribute, but they don't know how. So treat it as an emergency, mobilize the community, treat it as if 300 people were out on the street because there was an earthquake yesterday. And we would not let that persist for months and years. Number 2, use modern technology. And I would pull out my iPhone and talk about the app we developed when I was city manager in Santa Monica. We actually got LASA to give us HMIS, and then they said, we're never doing that again. Mm-hmm. Not because we screwed it up, but because they got this miasma of HIPAA and everything else that, as you point out, Brandon, is not necessarily based in law, but is sort of based in law-ishness. And then the third thing, and I always preface by saying this is the hardest and the most expensive and the least popular, and that is housing options, right? And then if people pressed me, I would tell them a story, which I won't impose on you for time reasons, about when I was on the council the first time and we managed to locate a shelter in my district. There are ways in which you can stuff things down people's throats that doesn't usually work. And there are ways in which you can provide informed consent. And that's what you tried to do with some success in San Diego is what do I get in the way of protection if I'm willing to have this adjacent to my neighborhood or in my neighborhood or down the street. But I will finish with a year after we located this shelter in my district across the street from a residential area, I had to knock on the door. I didn't have to. I could have skipped his house. But I decided I'm on the street. I'm going to talk to the main holdout who opposed it to the bitter end. And so I knocked on his door. I was surprised he greeted me very warmly, and he said, you know, we agree on most issues. We disagreed vehemently on the shelter. And he said, I have one regret about that. And I thought, well, here it comes, right? I'm finally going to get my comeuppance. Maybe I shouldn't have knocked on this door. And he said, I wish they'd moved in next door because they're much better neighbors than those jerks next door to me. They're literally across the street from him, and they're there 37 years later. That shelter is still operating seamlessly in the neighborhood, because at the beginning of the process, I said you can talk about parking, you can talk about signage, you can talk about staffing, you can talk about lighting, you can talk about security. Two things you can't talk about: those people. Some of them, I don't think any more lawyers, but you can't talk about those people, and you can't raise the question of, well, why does it have to be here? Because everyone says that, and if we said, well, if we had to answer that question, we'd never get anywhere. But we managed to find a way to persuade people, and it worked. So there is hope here, and I agree with Mayor Faulkner. We can't tackle this problem without a belief that it not only can be solved, it must be solved. All right, so questions? Right here.
Yeah, I want to address Attorney Brandon.
Sure.
And I'd like to see your response to this reality. You say that you're optimistic about the county. Okay, let me ask you how you can be optimistic when WASA has been around for 30 years, when Galbraith, the city controller, thought it was doing horrifically. It has no competition, where the county has not replaced supervisors in 40 years of political fighting. Where is the conflict that you think will make them do anything? And let me continue by saying that the budget now, is $45 billion in the county. Not long ago, it was $25 billion. We need 2 federal judges to deal with issues that politicians should be dealing with, like the county. The county's being sued for not building a jail pursuant to a consent decree of 2015. People are languishing without mental health services in the jail, okay? And when they're released, they're not given proper release criteria, etc. If it wasn't for the Alliance, nothing would be done in the city. So please respond. I want your optimism.
Sure.
Please fill in your optimism.
Well, I'll do something that I hate to do. Is I'll start by throwing the city under the bus, because
They're not here.
no, look, first of all, I think there has been a change in the leadership in the Board of Supervisors in the last 3 years that whereas before I think issues were not frontally addressed, they are on a much more direct basis now. I will say even this. The county is the only major governmental agency in this region that's actually done a really true internal review of what it wants to actually fix and is trying to fix it. And what I mean by that is taking a look at how it's organized, what its systems are, and what needs to change. I think the problem that the county has is also the reason why, again, I think I'm optimistic. The county only has 5 people. You can vote those people out. You can hold them accountable. They will be responsible.
When was the last time that happened?
That's the problem. That's the problem. That's the problem. We aren't holding our elected officials accountable in a way that makes it clear that the policies that are being driven by the elected officials are not the policies that people want to see. So I look at that situation, I'm more optimistic of the ability of people to actually vote people out than I am, again, and this is not a criticism, but of the city of Los Angeles, where you have multiple city council members who have various levels of authority. And at the end of the day, the county is a subdivision of the state of California. And there are, I think Stephen even spoke about kind of having the state take a more active role. Well, that's going to have to begin with the state taking an active role with the county.
And that was
and-
Proposition 1,
Yeah.
like it or not.
Right.
Over here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Evelyn, and I'm an alum of the School of Public Policy. Unshapely advertising. I agree with everything you've said. 9 years ago, my neighbors and I started a group called the LA River Walkers and Watchers, and we were supposed to just clean the upper river. But we quickly found ourselves doing outreach to the unhoused. And what we learned was, or is, that there are 12 different government entities responsible for the for the river. And we didn't have a memorandum of understanding for its safety and maintenance. And so we did our own outreach. We found out that LASA didn't have any people assigned to the river. And for the people who seek the river as a housing option, it's the place that they go to die. And that's what they communicated to us. That's what they communicated to our elected officials when we did tours with them, the engineers, the architects, everyone who built this bike path, which is going to be 51 miles. And we said to our city council members, we're not going to let you expand this bike path until you fix the problems that we currently have. It's been 9 years. We have a memorandum of understanding. I'm talking about 10 neighbors with the city and the county. And yes, my supervisor is so much better and responsive. But it's taken our community to go out, clear the brush on that bike path, clean it up, and do person-to-person outreach with every single person. And we've learned how the housing system works. And we know that shelters don't always work with everyone. And we know that the tiny houses are fantastic, the cabin communities are great. But some of these folks, especially those who come to the river, are so sick that even if we place them in the cabin communities, they die. They die because they're so sick. What they need is health care and mental health care and these resources that our county just isn't offering. And it's really the county. And we can throw the city under the bus as much as we want to, but the county has some millions of dollars to do this work. And our residents don't know it, and they yell at the council members. And I have to constantly tell people on social media and on Nextdoor, because I have access to 50 neighborhoods on Nextdoor. It's the county. Call your county supervisor.
Could we frame a question?
Yeah. So my question is, what about those areas where they're out of sight, out of mind, and we have homeless populations there, and the river is one of them? So for the county and for everyone here, does anybody deal with the river? The river.
So
Brandon?
technically, it depends on where it is, unfortunately. The county, there are flood control districts that might have authority. Yeah, well, but that's only for construction and infrastructure-related issues. But I think, so, speaking of why I'm optimistic about the county, this was one of the core issues that we looked at for our Blue Ribbon Commission on Homelessness. County has multiple departments that touch upon various issues and no consolidated response, which also affects the ability to actually tackle problems on an emergency basis. And the Board of Supervisors, on a very controversial but ultimately 3-2 vote, voted for a slate of recommendations, including the actual creation of a county entity that would be responsible, the focal point for all issues. Because right now I can't answer your question because there are 5 different government agencies, some of which are the county, some of which are federal, some state, maybe even local, that could touch upon that issue.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mayor.
We have a river in San Diego River. And one of the things that I think is also important, you can't just provide enforcement in parts of your city. It has to be all of it.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing, if you just here or here, right, learned that the hard way when I was first starting. And so part of that, we had the same issue that folks, if you started enforcing, going to go out into the river. We have a San Diego River Park Foundation. They're probably very similar, great group of volunteers. They go every week or every 2 weeks and help clean up and just, do things. And they would start to track the encampments, and the encampments were going up astronomically. And so I had them in my office. They gave me a map, and I said, what part of it, the city owns some property. I commit to you, we're going to go clean that up. And they said, yeah, Mr. Mayor, but the problem is if you clean it up, they're going to go right next door to the county owns part of this property. You have private property owners. I'm like, you're exactly right. So I got all of them in my office. And I said, we're going to clean up the entire river. I'm going to do what we're going to do in the city, and I'm going to make you a deal. I'm going to send our folks, we're going to clean up your property too. And we're going to clean it once. And once we clean it, you're going to be responsible for cleaning it. And if you don't clean it, I'm going to send folks out, and we're going to enforce it, and I'm going to send you the bill. Now, I'm not expecting you to deal with folks or others. There is a role if somebody's going to be for a law enforcement with a badge, but I'm not going to allow you to have a bunch of other things that are happening on property, because guess what? That's kind of bad for the environment too, and water quality, and all of the other stuff that for people to go out there. So that became an ongoing meeting of mine, once a month. And you know who was one of the biggest holdouts? It was the post office. Like, they own some property here. And I'm trying to get them to and finally I said, you're going to clean it next week. And if you don't, I'm doing a press conference next week. And you're going to get to know me real well. And they cleaned it. They're very nice. But the point, what I'm trying to make is people deserve help, support, all of the. And you can't allow a refuge for somebody to go out there and say, I'm going to put up a tent, do heroin and meth, and kill myself. I care about you too much to let you do that.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, we don't have time for a question and answers because we're literally at the hour. When I was city manager in Ventura, the police chief and the fire chief came to my office and said, we're going to see a La Nina this winter, and the last time we did, we had someone wash out from the river to see. We need to clear people out because not only are their lives in danger, but it's going to put our lives in danger if we have to go rescue them. And I said, well, that's great. Because they were putting the monkey on my back, right? You, the city manager, you have to figure out how to clear out these folks. And so we treated it as a community issue, not as a city issue. And we convened the service clubs, and we convened, so long story short, we created this thing called Camp Hope, where volunteer dentists would help people with their teeth, where volunteer doctors would help people with coming out of the river with their medical conditions. We had shelter beds lined up for folks. We had folks to take care of the pets, and veterinarians and volunteers. We had 20 people who were, actually 30 people who were holdouts. They said, we don't want to go to your shelter because we have conjugal relationships that are not allowed in the shelter. We have pets that are not allowed in the shelter. And so we're not leaving. And I said, well, everybody's leaving because it's going to rain and we're not going to leave you there. And we were at stalemate. And I said, well, if you all will find a nonprofit sponsor, we'll find you a place outside of the river. A nonprofit partner stepped up, which was fortuitously the mental health nonprofit in our community. Wow. And they created this thing called River Haven, and it operated for 30 years. It just closed down because the last folks cycled out. Long ago, the first 30 had moved on to all kinds of permanent housing or jobs or what have you. But I hope that we leave you with a sense of optimism, whether it's about the county or the city or changing our laws. Things can be done. This is not an insoluble problem. It's an incredibly hard problem, and it requires both and solutions, not just either or ones. That's one of the big problems. It's going to be both ands. It's going to take a lot of both ands, but we need to solve this problem. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.